Hello, this is Jim Edlin with some thoughts on the Foundry Publishing lesson for May 17, 2026. It's entitled Submission in the Power of the Spirit. So this is our seventh lesson in the series of Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And that means our focus scripture then is Ephesians 5, 21 through 28, and also Ephesians 6, 1 through 9. Which is where Paul gives very practical guidance for healthy relationships within families. The essential truth of this session is that healthy relationships among Christians include submission and sacrifice. So our goal is that people might commit to this godly submission in all their relationships. Well, Paul walks in where angels fear to tread, into the arena of family relationships. Families are so critical to our personal well-being, as well as to our witness to the world. Families hold the greatest potential for the most loving, supporting, and rewarding relationships you can find on planet Earth. But at the same time, families possess the greatest potential for intense drama, conflict, and even fragmentation. Undoubtedly, this is the reason Paul addresses this sensitive area. Family relationships were not just challenging for the Ephesians, they're also challenging for us today. We all need help in this arena of life. So, first of all, in chapter 5, verse 21 through 28, Paul begins by talking about the relationship between husbands and wives. He begins with a foundational principle that all healthy relationships are built upon: mutual submission. He writes in verse 21, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." Submit, it means to yield to the authority of another. And this challenge is laid out for both wives and husbands. So let's start with a question for husbands. How do husbands submit to the authority of their wives? What are some areas that a wife might possess greater authority than her husband? What does she know more about than he does? Now, let's turn over to talk about wives submitting, as Paul writes about that, particularly in verse 22. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. Let's ask, what are some areas in which the husband might have greater authority than his wife? What does he know about more than she? We might wonder, so what happens when the authority and the knowledge of both are pretty equal? So who makes the final decision about what to do? Well, the scripture does say in verse 23, the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. So it seems that the ultimate responsibility for a final decision lies with the husband. But you also know that that means that the ultimate blame for the decision rests with the husband also. Notice how the husband must make that final decision, though, out of Christ-like love for his wife. The scripture here says that husbands should love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, in verse 25. Christ is the example for husbands as they head up the family. Husbands are challenged to make decisions based on what is best for their wives. Husbands are called to sacrifice, like Christ, their own comforts for the sake of their wives. This is part of what it means to be mutually submissive. Notice the reason for this mutual submission. Out of reverence for Christ, it says in verse 21. In other words, mutual submission honors Christ. The question we might ask now is, how would you explain to a young couple what Paul has just been saying about the relationship between a husband and wife? What makes for a healthy relationship between them? And a question we might also throw in here is, how should Christian couples resolve disagreements when they both feel like they have the authority to make that decision. Here's my summary of what Ephesians 5:21 through 28 says, for what it's worth. A healthy relationship between a Christian husband and wife is based on mutual submission. It should follow the self-sacrificing example of Christ and, in the end, honor him. Well, Paul goes on to talk about other relationships in the family in chapter 6 in verses 1 through 4. That relationship between children and parents, another vital relationship within the family. To the children, Paul writes, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." Verse 1. Obey. That's a simple idea of listen and respond. Do what someone tells you to do. So fundamentally, it actually means to submit to the authority of another, once again. Question we might ask then is, what authority or knowledge might a parent have that children do not have? Well, I don't know if we have time to go through all of that, but it might be good to just think of a few. And then notice the reasons Paul commended children to submit to their parents. First of all, he says it's right. It's right before God, and in truth, it was right in a Jewish context as well as in a Greco-Roman culture. Second thing maybe is that he says that it's obeying the fifth commandment. Honor your father and your mother. Obedient children are honoring God's most basic commandment, one of the top 10. And then his third reason is that submission benefits the one who submits. He says, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on earth. He applies that word from the fifth commandment to the obedient child. Well, to parents, Paul writes, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." Verse 4. Exasperate literally means to make angry or to provoke to anger, as the English Standard Version says. Stir up anger, as the Christian Standard Bible says. Frustrate. Question we might ask ourselves, what might be some ways that parents could frustrate their children? We probably ought to identify a few of those things. And then he says, instead of frustrating the children, in verse 4, we are admonished to bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. What is that? What is the training and instruction of the Lord? Where do we find that instruction? I wonder if the Bible would be a good place to find that. Notice once again that mutual submission is key to the relationship, deferring to what is best for the other person in the relationship. Children submit to their parents' guidance. Parents not frustrating their children and giving them God's instruction, what's best for them. Well, the final relationship within the household that Paul talks about is in verses 5 through 8 of chapter 6. It's a relationship between slaves and masters. And you say, how is this a family relationship? Well, it's helpful to know that slavery was definitely widespread in the Roman Empire, very culturally acceptable, and the conquest of Rome actually produced many homeless and destitute people of those conquered peoples. So slavery actually became a means of gainful employment and livelihood for many people. And as a result, many households had slaves as part of their family, and they were part of the family in many ways. Some had good masters, and some masters were not so good. For us today, we might think about it more in terms of a relationship between an employer and an employee. Not that the employee is a slave, but this is kind of how we can apply these truths of this scripture. First of all, Paul addresses the slave or the employee. Obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. In other words, work at a job with respect, fear, and sincerity. What would that look like? Well, Paul explains. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people. So this is his basic idea. Work as slaves of Christ. Work from your heart. Work wholeheartedly. Work as if you are serving the Lord. What would that look like in our workplaces today? How would it change your work environment if your colleagues worked like this? And probably should ask, how would it change your work environment if you worked like that? Well, next, Paul addresses the masters or the supervisors or the employers. Treat your slaves in the same way, he says in verse 8. The same way that he's just talked about, with respect, fear, and sincerity. And what would that look like? Well, Paul explains at least one thing it means is no threats. Do not threaten them, he told the masters. The reason? Because you're both serving the same master. Since, as he says, you know that he who is both their master and yours in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. What would it look like for us in our world today if bosses treated their employees as fellow servants of Christ? How would that change our work environments? Notice once again that in this area, mutual submission is key to the relationship, thinking of what is best for the other person. Well, our scriptures today takes on very significant places in which we are challenged to have healthy relationships in our homes and in our workplaces. No two places of greater consequence for our well-being. So, can I ask you, how's it going for you? At home? In the workplace? What would you do or be willing to do to improve those relationships? Are you willing to submit to the authority of another person? Our scripture says that mutual submission is the key to those relationships, each person considering what is best for the other. May God help us strengthen those relationships in our families and in our workplaces.